So with that, I would like to introduce a man who is extremely passionate about civic engagement and is always available to assist and help us with anything related to civic engagement. A man that doesn't need a long introduction, but deserves a longer one than this for sure. But that is your borough president, Donovan Richards Jr.
Thank you, Timothy, and I don't need an introduction. It's not about me. I want to give you the kudos for continuing the tradition as we move into, well, now we're in September, so I want to welcome everybody back. And Tim has really redefined what civic engagement looks like in our office, and I'm proud of all the work that he's done in partnership with many of you on this line. In the space of civic engagement. So I want to give you your big kudos and thank you for everything you're doing from this down to our schools, in which you're educating our high school and middle school and elementary students on civic infrastructure, which is critical for the next generation as well. So it is great to see all of you after our little summer hiatus. Good evening, Queens. And if you are not part of what Timothy is building, I urge you to really become a part of it, because it's not just about redistricting. You know, many of the hard-hitting topics that Timothy is organizing around is holistic when it comes to the borough, and I want to thank him for what he's doing. Are y'all excited to hear about redistricting as I am? All right, maybe it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but it darn sure is important. And I'd like to welcome and thank each and every one of you for joining our New York City Council Redistricting Town Hall. Can you believe it's already September? I feel like I didn't even have a summer, which I really didn't, because I was out working hard for you, because you pay me to do that. You voted for me to do that. But I was able to steal a few days here and there. It feels just like yesterday we were out in the community asking folks to fill out their 2020 census form. Although I was not the Queensborough president back then, I know this office did a whole lot to ensure that Queens residents were counted in the 2020 census. And we are here today because redistricting is a process that takes right after the census count, and it impacts us all, whether we know it or not. After the population of the United States is counted every 10 years, a process called redistricting takes place to establish new political district lines, which hopefully represent the new population counts in communities all across the country. The lines of a political district can determine whether a community has opportunities to vote together to elect candidates who represent their interests, or whether they are divided up in ways that dilute the influence in their collective voice. Earlier this year, the New York State redistricting process took place, which established new state Senate and Assembly district lines, although I'm assuming we will be back for the Assembly district lines because of a court ruling. Now it's time for the New York City Council lines to be redrawn, and I've been through this process before as a staffer working for James Sanders at the time. For those of you who did not follow the New York State redistricting process, let's just say the New York City Council redistricting process was designed to operate much more smoothly. And I have a little bias. With Dennis Walcott serving as the chair of the New York City Districting Commission, I have no doubts that Dennis will ensure that this process takes place as equitably and as efficiently as possible to the very end. So far, there have been 2 rounds of public hearings that have taken place across the 5 boroughs, and the New York City Districting Commission is planning to publish its revised plans on September 22nd. All right, and I have to say this, that's the day before my mother's birthday, so I will wish her a happy birthday after. The 2 public hearings that took place in Queens were jam-packed, with folks giving passionate and detailed testimony. Many of you here today testified at these hearings. I thank you very much for making your voice heard on behalf of your community. While I'm not here today to talk or advocate for any particular district, I have this to say. Queens residents across the borough have showed up and stepped up. You've shown up every time we've asked you to advocate at these hearings. As the Queensborough president, it is my duty to serve the entire borough, over 2.4 million people. The entirety of Queens is my district. That is why I want to stress to folks that whether you are just learning about this process today or you have been following it closely from the start, continue providing testimony to the New York City Districting Commission till the very end. Let me give you a little context here. The 2013 New York City Districting Commission collected only 1,500 statements from New Yorkers. As we currently speak, the 2022 New York City Districting Commission is sifting through more than 8,300 testimonials, a record-breaking number for New York City. This just proves that the engagement from New Yorkers is on a whole other level this time around, and I'm proud of all of you in Queens who've advocated across the board. Today, we will be hearing from two speakers, Dan Kaminsky, who is the policy manager at Citizens Union. Dan will give us a presentation on redistricting, which will briefly go over how it began, where it is now, and what the last few months of the process will look like. Following Dan, we will hear from Stephen Romalewski, I hope I got that right, Romalewski, who is the director of CUNY Mapping Service at the Center for Urban Research at the CUNY Graduate Center. Stephen will show us the fascinating redistricting and U-Resource map, which makes following these district lines as they get released a breeze thanks to his interactive map. We are also joined by the godfather of redistricting, a good friend of mine who's really done some great work. We work with him, believe during the census as well, my friend, Professor Jeffrey M. Weiss, who is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the New York Law School, where he directs the New York Census and Redistricting Institute. Professor Weiss will be available for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Last but not least, I urge you all to share the information that you learned here today with your family, friends, and community members. Be sure to ask questions, engage in dialogue, and reach out to my office if you need any additional support or resources. We are here to ensure that you have all the information that you need. With that, I would like to now pass it back over to Timothy, who will go over some ground rules for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and seriously, thank you all for your civic engagement. I mean, we can't do this. We can't get out of this pandemic. We can't run this borough without our citizens who are engaged each and every day. And I think I see 176 folks on tonight. I want to thank you for showing up tonight. Thank you. God bless you all. Stay safe. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn it back to the man of the hour, Timothy.
Thank you so much, Borough President, and thank you for your fearless leadership on civic engagement issues and always being there to support us in everything that we do. With that, I'd like to quickly put up as a visual the agenda for today, just so everyone has a visual while I'll go over some couple of things we should remember. Please save your questions till the end during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We want the presentations to go smoothly and not get interrupted. But if there is something that comes across your mind, do write it in the chat. We'll try to follow up and get those questions in the chat as well. And if any of the presenters want to answer any of the questions in the chat in that moment, they can certainly do so. And just remember that today is all about education, and we need you all to get the most out of today's webinar. So do not be shy, ask questions, let your opinions and voices and concerns be heard, and we'll do our best to follow up and answer them all today. And with all of that being said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, Dan Kaminsky, who is the policy manager at Citizens Union Foundation. Dan, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Timothy. Good to see all of you. I will say I've been doing these for maybe 5 or 6 months now, and this tonight takes the cake at highest turnout. So kudos to Queens, y'all are doing something right, and kudos to the borough president. And his the borough president's introductory remarks really kind of gave a really good summary of what I'll talk about. I'll just go into a little more depth. So with that, let me share my screen and start by introducing myself. So my name is Dan Kaminsky, as was mentioned. I'm from an organization called Citizens Union. And Citizens Union is a good government group that's been focusing on all sorts of, ethics and accountability, transparency, voting rights, all sorts of issues. And we've been doing redistricting for a couple of decades now. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with the screen. And our role here is to both act as a watchdog on the process to make sure it's a fair, independent process, but also educate the public, which we're doing tonight. So we're not going to do too much on specific lines, but we will go over how this process works, why it matters, and where we are, as was said. So I'm going to start off at the ground floor. Maybe a bunch of folks know this, but if you don't, just to kind of get us all on the same page. So what is redistricting? So redistricting is the process of drawing new political boundaries that happens every 10 years after the census happens. And it takes into account the demographic and the population shifts that occurred over the last 10 years. And just to be very clear, today we're talking only about council redistricting. So I'm assuming folks have seen in the headlines, there's been a lot of them about what's gone on at the congressional and state level. We are leaving all of that conversation aside today, and we're only talking and thinking about what happened and what is happening right now with city council redistricts. So the current district map is on the right here, and I'm assuming Stephen will go through the proposed map a little bit later on. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the different criteria that commissioners have to use when they're drawing new maps. So there's a series of 8 criteria that commissioners have to follow as they're drawing new district boundaries. 4 of those criteria are required, and the other 4, the language in the charter, something along the lines of as much as possible. So I've split those up, and we're going to go one by one to talk about what these criteria are and why they matter. So starting with the top, 1 person, 1 vote. So this idea is that every district should have roughly the same number of people in it to afford each district roughly the same level of representation. What I mean by that, just in theory, let's just say if one district had 1 person and another district had 1 million people, obviously that 1 person would be incredibly well represented, and the 1 million people would be far less comparatively represented. So with that kind of understanding in mind, each district should have about the same number of folks. And so to get that same number of folks, the ideal population, as it were, is the total population divided by how many districts there are. So in this little diagram here, there were 100 people in New York City, and there were 5 districts. Each district, to have its ideal population, would be 20 people. To dial that into New York City terms, so after the 2020 census, we had 8.8 million people. That is the largest our city's ever been. It grew by about 630,000 people over the last 10 years, right? And we have 51 council districts. So when you do that basic math, you get to an ideal population of 172,000 people in it, right? So each district should have about that. But it's not expected that each district have exactly that ideal number. A 5% deviation is allowed. So that means that the difference between the smallest district in New York City over the next 10 years and the largest can have a difference of 8,644 people. Now, this actually changed last year. A 10% deviation historically was what was allowed, and Governor Hochul in October signed into law a 5% deviation. So that means that there can be less difference between the biggest and smallest districts in New York. And again, the ideal population is 172. Now, exact numbers are a little tricky, and that probably gets too in the weeds for this conversation, but I'll say the first round of numbers that we were told was the smallest district in New York City couldn't be smaller than 168,000. The largest couldn't be larger than 177,000 people. They then changed that, and currently the approximate numbers they're working with are 165,000 people to 174,000 people. For now, we can kind of forget that and just think about that 172,000 number, just for kind of ease of conversation. So I'm going to jump out of the presentation really quickly and look at some census data. So let me just get this a little bigger. So here is the 2020 census broken down by city council district. And I pulled up CD 26 because it's a good example, although there could be many, to look at population, right? So in the 2020 census, CD 26, which for folks that may not know is the western portion of Queens, Long Island City, neighborhoods around there, had 154,000 people. Now, if you've been to those neighborhoods, you know there's been immense growth. And so over the last 10 years, it grew by almost 30,000 people, right? So now the district has 183,000 people in it. Now, again, if you remember, that ideal population is 172,000 people. That means to get to the ideal population, 11,000 people will need to be shed from that district. How that happens has inherently political consequences, right? Because that means that for the people that get shifted out of that district, without moving, they will wake up and be in a different district represented by a different individual who may or may not have different priorities, right? And so how this happens really does matter. It really does affect, of course, how you're represented, which in turn can affect all sorts of other issues, which we can talk about. So that's the one person, one vote principle, kind of at the top of the list of how they're drawing these maps. Now, if we look at the citywide map of population, right, what we see if we zoom into Queens is that most Queens districts are underpopulated. So the orange is underpopulated, the green is overpopulated, and you see the key to the left there. The shade, depending on how deeply shaded is, how deep the under or overpopulation is, right? So we see that a couple districts will need to gain population. So the districts will need to be redrawn to, add more people into them so that they get up to those population standards, and others, really just CD26, actually, and some in Southeast Queens, will need to shed population. I think what's relevant to say here is two things. So one, again, New York City grew by 630,000 people. That is a lot of people, and that population was not distributed evenly. Some places grew, some places did not, et cetera. And two, we went from a 10% deviation allowed to a 5%. So you combine those two factors, right? We have a lot more people and a lot less wiggle room. That means that there are going to be necessarily substantial changes in district maps in New York City, right? Because of those two confounding factors. Okay, so that's the first criteria. Second criteria is protecting minority votes. That's the language of the act. So in 1965, arguably one of the most important things to come out of the civil rights movement was the Federal Voting Rights Act. And among other things, what it did is forbid new maps to dilute the voting power of racial and language minority groups. And the city charter has a very similar provision in it. So what that means tangibly, I kind of have this visual example. This is one of several potential examples, but let's just say that these red blocks in the center of the screen there are a protected group. They're a language or ethnic minority group, racial minority group, I should say. So a new map could not do what we see on the right. A new map could not draw lines in that way, because what that would do would be to dilute the voting power of that group. And again, that is not allowed under the Voting Rights Act. So one key thing to say about all of this, though, is that kind of the heart of the Voting Rights Act was this idea of pre-clearance. And what that meant was that jurisdictions with histories of discrimination were not allowed to implement any changes to their voting apparatus without first approving those changes with the Department of Justice, known as pre-clearance or pre-approval. And what this did, it acted as a shield so that districts with histories of discrimination couldn't act unilaterally to change anything about their voting apparatuses. In one of now many disastrous Supreme Court decisions in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down this pre-clearance requirement. And so this will be the first redistricting cycle where we do not have to submit our new lines for pre-clearance, right? So I put in on the right of the screen the front page of what that pre-clearance report from 10 years ago looked like. It's a several hundred-page document that goes through not only why having to prove to the Department of Justice that the lines were non-discriminatory, but also that the process was non-discriminatory and how they came to those lines. So again, this is the first time we're not doing it, and we are advocating for the commission to release a similar report, to justify their lines publicly. Third criteria is contiguous districts. So this is, I think, less relevant to a lot of districts in Queens, but and the idea here is that a district, part of a district can't be here and another part over here. It has to all be, contiguous, compact, and contained. And if it does cross a body of water, as an example is the new CD26 they're proposed, it has to be connected by a tunnel, a bridge, a tram, some way of connection to the district. And the fourth one, crossover districts. This is only relevant to one district in Queens. So ideally, each district is contained entirely within a county. If there's an example where a district has to cross over borough boundaries, that can only happen one time per set of 2 boroughs. So right now, District 34 is the example that has a part of Brooklyn and a part of Queens. That's the only time a district can be part of both Brooklyn and Queens. No other place in Queens and Brooklyn can be contained, can share a district. So those are the first 4 criteria. I hope all of that made sense. Those are the things that the commissioners have to be thinking about or required to be thinking about as they create their new district maps. The next 4, as said, are the language in the charter is as much as possible, so that the commissioner should be thinking about these things, and they should be thinking about them in the order of priority that I put them on the screen. So keeping neighborhoods and communities of interest intact is the most important, followed by the next few. So I'll just spend a minute on this. First here, let's just define community of interest. So I'll just read this verbatim. A community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or a group of people who have common policy concerns and would benefit from being maintained in a single district. Another way of understanding a community of interest is that it's simply a way for a community to tell its own story about what neighbors share in common and what makes it unique when compared to surrounding communities. It is defined by local community members. So I think what stands out to me about this definition is, unlike the last few, which had some pretty strict criteria about what is and what is not allowed, this is kind of the opposite, right? This is essentially the commissioners saying, you tell us what your community is, and we will do our best to keep it contained within a district. So I'll give some examples, but really I think the point should be, you can throw all the examples out the window because you are the expert in your community, and however you define your community is the definition that should be used should you, and we hope you do, testify if there's another opportunity, we'll get to that later, about what the community is. So some examples, socioeconomic status could be one, right? People that share similar professions, people that share similar housing types, right? Let's just say you live around a bunch of renters and several blocks away are homeowners, and you want to ensure that all the renters in your area maintain in a single district to ensure that the needs of renters are on the mind of your council member. Transit lines, school districts, shopping districts, right? Anything that you're defining as a significant area of interest or significant, aspect of your community is your community of interest. Let's skip a few of these. Now, I want to give a visual example of why this matters. I'm not a graphic designer, so I apologize for the very simple graphic, but I think still the point will get across. So let's just say that this square here is New York City, or rather Queens. And let's say that these black lines are the district lines. And let's say this gray circle right in the center is your community of interest, whatever that is, school, neighborhood, you name it. And let's say these other circles are other communities of interest, right? So in this current map, whoever is representing that red square is potentially going to take the concerns of your community far less seriously than they're going to take the concerns of these other circles, right? You represent just a fraction of voters, you're off in a corner of a district, and so you'll be much less present for that council member. That could in turn lead to less funding, less legislation, less media attention, less advocacy, less attention, all of which could mean that whatever your major issue is could get worse, right? So where redistricting really plays a central role is it allows us to re-envision what the map looks like, and by doing so, re-envision in many ways who is represented and how they are represented. So let's just say that same map looked like this, right? Now, whoever's representing that red square, who's ever elected to represent the red square, will have to take into account the concerns of your community, because you're right in the heart of the district. You represent a plurality, likely, maybe a majority of voters in the district. And so chances are the concerns that you're most worried about, this map will yield far better results than this map. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that kind of puts into perspective the opportunity and the importance of this process. I'm just going to skip a couple slides. I'll go back in a second, but just to hammer home on that point, I think that it really shouldn't be understated the importance of who you're represented by on the council is. So your council member has some pretty important and unique powers. I often like to say, look out your window and virtually everything you're seeing has your council member has an effect over, whether that's the trash or the parks or the schools or the police or, really you name it. And council member is the person that has a really important sway in that. Of course, a lot of people are really focused on federal politics. Of course, that's super important too. But when we're talking about neighborhood issues, what is it like to live in your neighborhood in a day-to-day way? I'd argue that your council member is one of, if not the most important person to affect those things. So a couple basic items that your council member has pretty broad powers over. One is land use, right? So there's the tradition of member deference, which is just a tradition. It's not written to law, but that says that in a rezoning application, how the council member of a specific district votes, the rest of the council often tends to vote. That means that your council member has a lot of sway in the built environment of your neighborhood, right? What is there? How does it feel, et cetera. Your council member has discretionary funds, right? So they have millions of dollars every year to spend in your district. They're the legislative body of New York City. So is legislation being introduced and voted on in ways that feel aligned with your priorities and your community's priorities? They provide a key role in the budget process, right? So I would say the budget is one of, if not the most important documents that come out of our city every year. It's really a moral document that's deciding what is funded and by how much. And your council member plays a key role in that as well. And they provide constituent services at the most local level, right? So all of this is to say that who you are represented by really matters, and how the lines are drawn in turn affects ultimately who you can elect and who you will be represented by. To go back to the final criteria that I'll discuss and then I'll move forward is keeping neighborhoods intact. So I mentioned communities of interest. Now I want to talk about neighborhoods. So here I'm going to switch over to the New York City Population Fact Finder tool. There's a really, really wonderful and handy tool. I will switch over to neighborhood tabulation area. So that's going to cut New York City into neighborhoods. And then I'll add the map layers and I'll add in council districts. You could also do this to some degree on Redistricting NU, which you'll be shown. It's an amazing, amazing website. But so I'll look at Queens, and the district or the neighborhood that I think is a worthwhile example right away to jump into is Richmond Hill. So if you look at Richmond Hill, right, I'm going to highlight the area. And if you see that district is that neighborhood, I should say, is split into 3 different council districts. So what that means is that for people in the neighborhood, depending on which side of the street you live on, you could have one of 3 different elected officials who you're going to raise concerns. Again, we're not here to endorse or support or oppose any particular lines, but I will say often members in communities and neighborhoods where it's this configuration where they're split up into multiple districts are quite opposed to it because it often means that the services and resources needed by that community are deprioritized compared to neighborhoods that are entirely within a full council district. So if we were to go through all of Queens, we would find many such examples of neighborhoods that are split in multiple districts. And as said, this is something that the commission will be looking at in this cycle, or can look at. Again, it's in that 4 of things that they should look at, but is not required. So those are the compactness we more or less mentioned. And then the final one I will mention briefly is preventing partisan gerrymandering is also one of the criteria. Here, at least from the good government perspective, we are less concerned with partisan gerrymandering because of the dynamics of New York. It's hard to draw district lines in a way that's going to favor one political party over another, just considering the political dynamics of New York City. More so when we think of gerrymandering in the council context, we're more concerned about drawing lines that will be favorable for a certain incumbent over another, or a certain political candidate over another. That's the sort of thing that we, as a good government group, are more focused on. Okay, so that was everything I just talked about is what the commission has to do, right? The task ahead of them, which is a monumental task, redrawing the map in a way that adheres to all of those criteria that I just laid out. Now let's talk about how it's going to unroll, how it's going to unfold. So firstly, I've been saying the commission. Who is this commission, right? Who is it that's drawing these maps? So the district commission is made of 15 people. Those 15 people were appointed in February and March, respectively. So in February, the mayor appointed 7 members, right? So the mayor gets 7 appointees, and the other 8 are appointed by city council. Those 8, 5 of them were appointed by the Democratic Conference, 3 of them were appointed by the Republican Conference. So that's the 15. They have started their work for quite some time. They elected their own chair, which I think Timothy mentioned before, maybe it was the borough president, is a man named Donovan Richards, who may be a familiar name because, named Dennis Walcott, who may be a familiar name because he is the current head of the Queens Public Library, former education chancellor, been around New York City politics for a while. So here's, in terms of the timeline, here's how it's gone and here's how it will go. So the preliminary hearings were at the end of May and the end of June. And those preliminary hearings were a time for New Yorkers to show up and tell the commission what they wanted in the first map. The commission listened held those hearings, and a couple weeks after, on July 15th, they published their first draft of a map. And that is something that I think is really important to stress, that the map that you all have seen is a first draft. It is not set in stone. They will be revising it, and if it gets rejected, they will rise again. After that July 15th presentation of that draft map, they gave New Yorkers 30 days to digest the map, to look it through, to consider how it affects them. And then they held a round of public hearings in August, which was mentioned. The attendance was unbelievable, historical, broke all the records in all the ways. Right now, we are in the 1 month waiting period for them to synthesize all the testimony they got, consider all the feedback they got, and propose a new revised map based on that testimony. So on September 22nd, which is next week, next Thursday, I believe, they will vote on and publish the revised map and send it to City Council. After they send it to City Council, the City Council will have 3 weeks to accept or reject the maps. If they do nothing, it's automatically accepted. And if they accept it, obviously it's accepted. And so this whole process could be over in about a month. If they reject the maps, the speaker will send over comments as to what they didn't like about the maps and why they were rejecting it, along with any individual member who may comment as well about their specific districts or why they were rejecting it. And that's a full council vote. After the rejection, it'll go back to the commission. Essentially, the commission will go back to the drawing board. They don't have to take into account the council's feedback, but they can. They will redo the map. And then after they redo the map, and we don't know what the dates are of that yet, they will publish it, and there will be a new round of hearings for people to plug into. If that were to happen, I strongly encourage folks to plug into that, to testify, to make your voices heard. I think that's really kind of the essence of the whole process, is citizen testimony, and I can say a few words on that in a moment. But so that would be in the late fall, and again, we don't have the exact dates yet. If the council rejects the map, then we will find out kind of what the rest of the process looks like. The final deadline, which we finally got confirmed recently, the commission had changed some dates, is December 7th, which is a pretty tight timeline from today. So it's only a couple months away is the final deadline for the commission to submit the final map to the city clerk. Now, one thing that's key to notice here is you may see it doesn't say city council, it says city clerk. And that's because the city council does not have authority over the final map. So long as 9 out of the 15 commissioners vote to accept the final map, that is the final map. City council cannot change it, cannot alter it, cannot sway it cannot reject it in any way. And so from an independent standpoint, this is a structure we like a lot because it shouldn't be elected officials who have final say over the district lines that end up impacting if they get elected or not. So here it's the commission that has the final sway over the map. Certainly there are a lot of very justifiable concerns about this process, especially in regard to what happened at the state level. But again, because of this independence, there's at least some structural guarantee of separation in the council version. Then after that, so, usually council terms are 4 years. You may be aware that this year, the council term is only 2 years, and that's because of this process. So almost immediately, city council members or, new candidates will begin running. February 28th is the start of petitioning. And then in June 2023, there will be a council primary. And that primary will be in these new districts, to reflect the new lines that have been drawn. And that is the entirety of the process. The final thing that I'll say, unless Timothy, please feel free to add anything else you want me to talk about, and I'm happy to, but the final thing I want to say is that if it does become necessary that there is a new round of hearings, we, again, really want to encourage folks to testify and to get involved in it. And I want to give an example here of why it's important. I'm doing this somewhat at random, but so here, the document I just pulled up is the staff memoranda from 2012. And what this document is the explanation for why they chose the lines that they did 10 years ago. And so here, I'm just pulling up somewhat randomly a district in Queens, but I'm doing this with full faith that it'll work. So District 30 is comprised of the neighborhoods of Middle Village, Maspeth, Ridgewood, and Glendale. Maybe some folks here are in District 30. That district was within acceptable population deviation range, blah, blah, blah. Here's the point that I'm trying to make. Specifically, in response to public testimony, the revised plan is able to bring the entirety of Maspeth as defined by Newtown Creek to BQE and Queens Boulevard into District 30. So the point that I'm trying to make here is they created one map. People came out in droves and said, hey, from District 30 and said, hey, we believe this is what District 30 should look like. And as such, they listened, right? And if you were to go through every single one of these districts, almost every single one says something similar, that in response to public testimony, we made this and this change, right? And so if you've ever engaged with city government, sometimes it can be really hard to get what you want, but this happens to be a process where, at least historically, the commissions have accepted, listened to, and adhered to, at times, citizen feedback. And I can certainly say, if you don't participate in the process, you definitely won't get what you want. Whereas if you participate, there's a chance that you do. If you do want help writing your testimony, I will put again, should that be necessary, should the council reject, and we don't know what's going to happen, but I will put my information in the chat. I'd be happy to reach out. You can absolutely reach out to me. Sorry about that. And we also, and I haven't talked to Timothy about this, but if there's interest, we could also do a follow-up workshop with this group where we go over how to write a testimony, kind of what are the essential elements of an effective testimony, how to create your own maps, and any other thing that could be helpful for folks trying to engage in the process. So with that, I'll turn it over, but I'm here for any questions, and I'm here to help out really however I can as this process unfolds. And Timothy, if there was something you wanted me to talk about that I didn't, you can just ping me now and I'll talk about whatever. So.
Well, first off, thank you very much for that very concise and clear presentation. You covered everything pretty much that we were hoping for you to cover. The one thing I would just, if you could clarify, because some folks in the chat are writing, even if there's not a third round of public hearings, folks can continue sending written testimony, right? To either the email or even by mail. They can mail it to the districting commission until the very end, until they shut that option down. Folks can continue doing that, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I can also put in the chat the email address to email. I would say the sooner the better if you're trying to get your thoughts in. They're presenting their maps September 22nd, so they're revising the maps right now. And so the sooner you can get any thoughts in, if you haven't been able to, the better. Yeah. And as said, if they do go to a third round, which I'll say candidly, I definitely have an expectation that it will, but obviously we don't know. But that expectation is based off the fact that many council members have come out against the preliminary map. The speaker has also voiced opposition to some of the parts of the map, but we don't know what the revised map will look like and if it'll address those concerns. And so we obviously don't know for sure. So.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dan, for that. And thank you for your presentation. We will take Q&A a bit later because the chat has not stopped since we started. So with that, and folks, please keep in mind, when we do get to the Q&A, I see a lot of discussion going on. Let's please focus on today's topic, which is redistricting. If there's things you want to see covered at another meeting, email me, we'll make it happen. I see a lot of DOE and education related stuff, so we can definitely bring the DOE in here, have a conversation with them. With that, up next, we'll be hearing from Stephen Romalewski, who is the director of the CUNY Mapping Service at the Center for Urban Research at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And Stephen is a long-time veteran in the world of redistricting. And the map that he's going to show everyone, it really is simple. I know maps can be confusing, but the redistricting and new resource map is very simple and easy to follow. And the way Stephen presents it and explains it is very straightforward. So with that, I'd like to introduce and pass it over to Stephen.
All right, thanks very much. Really appreciate being here. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the borough president, Tim and his team. And we at the CUNY Graduate Center's Center for Urban Research have spent a lot of time examining population data, population trends, demographic information. Our director, John Mollenkopf, has spent many years looking at this, especially through the lens of immigrant populations and cultural change in New York City and elsewhere. And one thing that I do and my team does is try to take a lot of that information, which sometimes can be complex and a bit daunting, and try to make it easier to access and appreciate by visualizing it, often through maps. For example, we worked very closely with a nationwide coalition of funders and stakeholders throughout the 2020 census process we created a nationwide interactive map that highlighted communities that were considered hard to count for various reasons. And groups use that in New York and elsewhere to try to pinpoint and prioritize their outreach efforts leading up to the 2020 census and during the census when the data was being collected. And so we've been very involved in the census. And then as a natural extension of that, we have been working in the redistricting arena, doing something that was similar to what we did 10 years ago in New York, but on a bigger scale and hopefully with better online tools to make it easier for everyone to understand. So Dan gave a really fabulous, comprehensive introduction and overview of the process of redistricting, who is doing redistricting in New York City, why it's being done, and the like. And so redistricting is, on one level, all about maps and all about how to take the current city council districts and figure out how to redraw them so that they meet the criteria from the charter and other requirements that Dan laid out. And everyone should be interested in that. Obviously, everyone on this call is interested in that, so that's a really good indication of the interest in Queens. But a lot of people aren't, and they may think, well, if they hear redistricting, they may think that's just a backroom thing. It's, for political insiders. I'm not going to bother, but it impacts them and they should care. And so what we wanted to do as our contribution to this effort was create an online map that was hopefully very easy to use, that would make it easy for people to find out what their current district looks like. They may not know that. And then to very easily see how that district might change if the commission's proposal is adopted, or if the city council's proposal is adopted, or if other plans are adopted, and what that means for them. And so I'll share my screen and I'll show you what we call our Redistricting in You application or platform or online map. When you first come to the site, you see the map of the proposed city council districts and some information on the left side and the right side of the map. And you can type in an address, you can type in a community name, you can type in a zip code, or you can just click on the map. I saw in the chat people were talking about Kew Gardens, so I'll just type in Kew Gardens, Queens, or I won't even need to type in Queens, I'll just say Kew Gardens, and I'll click and it'll zoom to roughly the Kew Gardens neighborhood. On the left side of the map, we display information about the current district, who represents it now, what the population is based on the 2020 census for the current district. The current lines were drawn back in 2013 based on the 2010 census. As Dan pointed out, there's been a lot of population change in New York. And so how does the population now look in those, what soon will be old lines? And then we show some information about the demographic characteristics, some voting patterns and party enrollment. And I'll go through each of these in some more detail, but the main thing you can do with the map is at the top of the map here, there's a little blue dot you can grab a hold of. And if you move it all the way to the left, you'll see the current lines. And you'll see what communities they represent and what features are in there, what landmarks are in there. And as you move the slider, this blue dot to the right, it changes the map and you can see how those district lines will look under the districting commission's plan. On the right side, if you've selected a district on the map, we show information about the proposed district. And this drop-down list at the top of the right side panel here, we show information for a bunch of different proposals, not just the districting commission's plan, but also the Unity Map plan, which is a coalition of voting rights organizations in New York City, and they've come up with their own proposal. A couple of residents, I think one of them might be from Queens, came up with their own proposals, and we show those. When the commission publishes its updated plan in September later this month, we'll add that, and so you can see how their preliminary plan changed, if at all. If the council comes up with its own plan, we'll add that. If anyone else publishes a citywide plan, we'll add that as well. When the state redistricting was happening, we have a version of this for the entire state. We had probably a dozen or so different plans that people can compare. And so you can see how this proposed District 29 would look if the Unity Map coalition plan was in effect, or if Aaron Fernando's plan was in effect. And you can see how the lines would change, and also how the population would change. So on the right side panel, we show what the population is based on the 2020 census of each of the proposed districts. Dan mentioned that it's a very important characteristic of redistricting is population equality. So we show here the average district population size, and then how much this proposed district would be above or below that population, and percentage-wise, how much it's above or below. If you put your mouse over this little blue dot with a letter I in it, we highlight the section of the city charter that corresponds with. So you can see exactly how the information on this redistricting and new map ties in with the requirements that the districting commission will need to follow. These little pie charts below the population data show what the overall kind of crude named race and Hispanic origin patterns are for the selected district. So this particular one, Council District 29, would be about 30% Asian, just about 43% white, 20% Hispanic, and then the remaining small percentages, other races, Black, other multiple races. And you could also move your mouse over the legend elements in the bottom here and highlight those, and you can see the exact percentage numbers. And so that could be very helpful when you're trying to think about, well, what's the community look like and how would this district change based on what the old numbers look like, and what does that mean for the Voting Rights Act, and what does that mean for coalition building within the district. We show how compact it is, which is, it's not a great metric in some ways. And there's as Dan mentioned, one of the lower priority criteria in the city charter is the district can't be too long and narrow. And so this indicates if it is. And then we also show the 2021 mayoral election results and also party enrollment, both to think about communities of interest. And then also there is a criteria in the charter that the district lines can't inappropriately concentrate or split apart people by their voter registration status. As Dan pointed out, the majority of the city is registered Democrat, but there are concentrations of people that are registered in other parties. And this pie chart here at the bottom of the panels gives you the statistics for the overall district. Now, you might think, well, all right, what's going on within the district? I'm going to go back to the council's plan. On the left side here, we can switch to this legend tab, and we can show other things, such as the patterns within the district of the major race and Hispanic origin categories. These are using the census terminology of how people self-report during the 2020 census. Asian is a pretty broad generic category, for example. Black is the same, Hispanic, there's a lot of variation obviously within that. We don't really have that data yet from the 2020 census. We'll get it eventually from the Census Bureau, but not until next year. And so for now, we just show these overall categories, but you can get a sense of, what the patterns are in the district. And importantly, if the lines have changed, which population groups are being moved out of the current district and into other districts, or are they being split up, or are they being, concentrated inappropriately? And the map can show that, and you can zoom out and see those patterns across the borough as well, not just within the district and across the city. We also show voter registration patterns for each of the major parties. As you can see, dark blue is large concentration of Democratic enrollees, and most of Queens is like that, but not everywhere. And so if you look at the registration for Republicans, there are some concentrations in various parts of Queens, and also people that have registered under no party affiliation. There's concentrations of them as well. And then finally, the mayoral election results. And you can see what those patterns look like by voting precinct within each proposed and current city council district and across the borough and across the city. And so all of this information you can use to evaluate what you think of the city commission's district proposal, of the other proposals, and do these make sense to you, and should the commission go ahead with them, or should they do something different? You can share links to your map when you've zoomed into a particular district and highlighted it and customized the map view. And so you can share that on social media or your Facebook group or whatever. And you can print out a map and you can show that to the commission and include it in your public testimony. There have been some community blogs that'll take screenshots of the map and highlight it so people can, see what's going on. And then you also can, and I'll just remove the voting layer. There was a lot of talk in the chat tonight about how the districts match up, how the current districts and the proposed districts match up with neighborhoods and with community boards. And so you can see that exactly on the map. So you can use this toggle switch over here on the left panel to see what the community board boundaries look like and how closely the current lines line up with existing, or how closely
looks like Stephen froze at the most crucial moment. Give it a second. Maybe his. Yeah, Dan, if you want to jump
what
in.
I think is, well, I can pick up a question that I'm getting asked a bunch in the chat, and then he can, whenever he's back on, continue what he's saying, which is how do community boards districts play into this? So just as a kind of premise, community board districts are a different process altogether. Community board redistricting happens at the behest of the mayor on the 4th, right? So it's 14, 24, etc. I don't know if, Stephen, that's where you're going. It looks like you're back now, though, so you can finish whatever thought you were.
Did everyone lose me, or did I lose you, or what happened?
I think everyone lost you. You froze for some time.
Sorry about that. Well, I don't know where I got frozen, but I'll jump back in. And I was showing the community boards and also the neighborhood areas on the map. These are neighborhood tabulation areas. They don't necessarily match up with everyone's perception of what their neighborhood or understanding of what their neighborhood is. These are neighborhood boundaries that have been drawn by the New York City Planning Department's Population Division, and they line up with population concentrations, but they come pretty close to neighborhood areas. And so you can see, like this is Richmond Hill, that the example Dan was showing from Population Fact Finder. So you can see how it was, chopped up in the current configuration, but the new district boundaries are, much better in terms of including the entire neighborhood in one council district. There's, my volume up. You can see how this compares with the Unity Map Coalition. They handle this a little bit differently, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can, easily compare and contrast how the proposed lines match up with these different characteristics. I'd be interested in getting people's feedback. Others have asked if we can add other types of boundaries like police precincts or local school districts. That's something that we're open to, and so we'd be happy to hear people's thoughts about that. Now, let me just point out one more thing, and then I'll turn it back to Tim. So our effort is all about presenting this information so people can evaluate the information about the current and proposed districts. And this is not designed to draw your own maps. And other organizations are doing that really well, and we didn't want to duplicate efforts, and we think this is a very simple, easy way for people to kind of get into the process. But if you're really eager to not just look at what the maps look like, but draw your own, you could do that too. The City Districting Commission has worked with a group called District R to create an online platform where you can draw your own districts. And another online application, and these are both free and relatively easy to use, is called Dave's Redistricting app. And it's created by this guy named Dave, a volunteer, used to work for Microsoft. And he created this online platform that was used extensively in every single state of the country throughout the this current redistricting cycle. And it's very powerful in terms of redistricting analysis and not just drawing the lines, but instantly analyzing the maps to see if they meet the criteria that they need to meet, so there's no lawsuit over them, for example, and they actually can be enacted as new plans. When you look at on our redistricting and you map, and you're looking at one of the districts and you have the district commission's preliminary plan, we have a link here that says you can draw your own plan based on the districting commission's plan here. And if you click that link, and people can see now a different map. This is what would open up, and you would be able to then edit this. And so what this shows is the black lines show the current city council districts, and the color shaded lines show the proposed districts from the commission's preliminary plan. I'm not going to go into great detail as to how you use this. There are various tutorials, and it's a bit of a learning curve, but once you get the hang of it, it's really, really powerful. And you can come up with district plans that, pass muster, basically. And so, for example, one thing that you may have noticed is that Council Speaker Adams' district, Council 28, includes all of Rochdale Village. And the proposed plan from the commission splits that. And you can see that black outline here includes the whole village, and The proposed plan, the Council District 27 in green and 28 in pink, splits the village right in two. And so how can you fix that? Let's say you wanted to draw a proposal and submit that to the commission that says, no, we should have all of this in one district. It's very easy to do, and you could just literally paint, as they call it, and you can click on the map and highlight these voting precincts, which are the pink outlines, and you can change what the map looks like. And as you do that, you can see the population numbers here in this left-hand panel change. And so you can see at a glance, if I make this change, what does that mean for the population equality criteria? What does it mean for the partisan makeup of the districts? What does it mean for the Voting Rights Act criteria? And it's very powerful. So anyway, just as a resource and to think about, this is one way that you can go one step further than just looking at the maps in Redistricting EU and actually draw the maps that you want. I'll refresh Redistricting EU, and when you first come to the map in the right side panel here, we have a link excuse me, to a few different versions of the City Council District on excuse me, Dave's Redistricting app in the right panel here. You can click on any one of those and get started with drawing your own maps. And work, and also, it's really important to work with other organizations like the Unity Map Coalition that are already doing a lot on this, and Common Cause has been involved in addition to Citizens Union, and so you can draw your own maps on your own, or you can work in collaboration with these other organizations. So I'll end it there, and also just to point out that I think I mentioned this early on, once the commission publishes an updated map plan later this month, we'll add that to the Redistricting EU map, and so you can come back and see what these look like. And we'll also be adding other plans if other stakeholder groups like the Unity Map Coalition publishes updates to their plan as well. So I'm happy to answer questions and join in the discussion. I'll hand it back to Tim.
Thank you very much, Stephen. As always, very concise and easy to follow presentation, and the map is just incredible.